Claire Bennett was 52 years old when her 28-year marriage ended with a signature on a courthouse document and a cardboard box of belongings. Friends whispered that she was too old to start over. Her own brother laughed when she inherited their grandfather's bankrupt vineyard, saying it wasn't a second chance, it was financial suicide. The vines were dying, the debts were crushing, and foreclosure was only weeks away. Everyone believed she'd sell the land, walk away, and quietly disappear from the family story. But while cleaning her grandfather's abandoned winery, Claire discovered something no one else had ever seen. A hidden journal that pointed to a forgotten part of the vineyard, and a secret he had protected for decades. What she found there would not only save the vineyard, but change the future of her entire family forever. But before I tell you what was hidden beneath those aging vines, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. Leave a comment below so I can say hello. And if you're starting your morning with this story, I hope you have a wonderful day filled with peace and good news. If you enjoy heartfelt stories about family, resilience, and second chances, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you won't miss our next journey. Now, let's go back to the day Claire stepped onto her grandfather's vineyard. Completely unaware that her life was about to change forever. The final signature took less than 5 seconds. 28 years of marriage disappeared beneath the smooth stroke of Claire Bennett's pen. She thanked the clerk with a quiet smile, gathered the small cardboard box holding the last of her office papers, and stepped into the bright California afternoon. The courthouse parking lot was busy with strangers beginning ordinary days, but Claire stood beside her aging sedan for several moments before unlocking the door. At 52 years old, she had expected to be planning retirement with someone she had trusted for most of her adult life. Instead, she was calculating how long her savings would last and wondering where she belonged now. The drive back to her modest apartment outside Santa Rosa felt longer than usual. The radio remained off. Every familiar road reminded her that almost everything she had imagined for the future had quietly disappeared. By the time she reached home, her phone had collected several missed calls from friends offering sympathy she did not yet know how to accept. She set the phone on the kitchen counter without listening to the messages. The silence inside the apartment felt strangely comforting until another call appeared. This one came from Michael, her older brother. Claire hesitated before answering. Michael rarely called unless something important had happened. His voice sounded unusually subdued. "Claire, Grandpa Henry passed away early this morning." She closed her eyes immediately. The divorce had already drained every ounce of emotion she possessed. Yet hearing those words opened a different kind of pain. Henry Bennett had raised grapes his entire life. Even as a little girl, Claire had followed him through the vineyard carrying a basket far too large for her small hands. He had patiently shown her how healthy vines needed careful pruning, how good harvests rewarded patience rather than haste, and how every season brought another chance to begin again. During the past few years, she had visited less often than she wished, always promising herself there would be more time after work slowed down. Now there wouldn't be. "When?" she asked softly. "Around dawn." Michael paused. "The funeral is Friday. The attorney wants us there afterward. Grandpa left instructions about the estate." Claire looked through the apartment window toward the distant hills. "I'll be there." 3 days later, the family gathered at the small country church overlooking the valley where Henry Bennett had spent nearly 70 years tending vines. The service was simple. exactly as he would have wanted. Neighbors filled the wooden pews alongside vineyard workers who had known him for decades. Sofia Ramirez, the vineyard's longtime manager, sat quietly near the front, holding a single white rose. Claire recognized almost every face. Many had grown older alongside Henry, yet each person seemed to carry genuine affection for the quiet man, whose greatest pride had never been awards or profits, but caring for the land entrusted to him. After the final hymn, mourners drifted toward the cemetery overlooking rows of dormant grapevines waiting for spring. Claire stood beside the fresh grave long after most people had left. She remembered Grandpa's weathered hands guiding hers as she learned to prune vines without damaging new growth. "Never rush living things," he used to say. "Good roots take time." She wished she had visited one more time simply to hear those words again. The family reconvened that afternoon at the attorney's office in town. Thick folders covered the conference table. Michael sat across from Claire, rubbing tired eyes. Several cousins exchanged uneasy glances while the attorney reviewed Henry's will. The vineyard's finances, he explained carefully, had deteriorated over the previous several years. Declining harvests, costly repairs, drought conditions, and outstanding loans had created debts far larger than anyone expected. The room became noticeably quieter as the figures were read aloud. Claire watched Michael lean back in disbelief. One cousin quietly muttered that selling immediately seemed unavoidable. Then the attorney opened another folder. Mr. Henry Bennett made one very specific decision regarding ownership. He looked directly at Claire. He has left the vineyard, winery, and ranch house entirely to his granddaughter, Claire Bennett. Silence settled over the room. Claire blinked, convinced she had misunderstood. "To me?" "Yes." The attorney slid a document across the table. "Your grandfather updated his will 3 years ago." Michael stared at the paperwork before looking toward his sister. "Claire, are you sure he wasn't mistaken?" The attorney shook his head. "The documents are very clear." Another cousin gave a short laugh, filled with disbelief. "Congratulations, you inherited a mountain of debt." Michael sighed heavily before speaking again. "Claire, listen to me. Grandpa loved that vineyard. But the numbers don't lie. You should sell before the bank takes everything." "I haven't even seen the financial reports yet," Claire answered quietly. "You don't need to. They're terrible." He leaned forward, his voice carrying more concern than anger. "You've just gone through a divorce. Starting over with a bankrupt vineyard isn't a second chance. It's financial disaster." Claire understood his reasoning. She had spent years working as an accountant. The practical decision was obvious. Sell the property, satisfy as much debt as possible, and move forward. Yet something about accepting that answer immediately felt like abandoning Henry before she had even stepped back onto the land he loved. "I'd like to see it first," she said. Michael rubbed his forehead. "Seeing it won't change the debt." "Maybe not." She gathered the inheritance documents. "But I owe Grandpa that much." By late afternoon, she drove through the familiar valley toward Bennett Vineyard. The entrance sign leaned slightly after years of weather. Weeds pushed through cracks in the gravel driveway. Winter vines stretched across rolling hills beneath pale clouds, their bare branches revealing rows that once seemed endless during childhood summers. The ranch house looked smaller than she remembered. Paint peeled from the porch railing, and several shutters hung crookedly. Even so, the place carried a quiet dignity that years of neglect had not erased. Claire parked beside the old barn and stepped out into cool air scented with damp earth. She walked slowly between the vineyard rows, brushing her fingertips across rough vine trunks. Some plants appeared healthy despite the season. Others showed signs of disease or neglect. She noticed broken trellis wires, aging irrigation lines, and equipment sitting unused beneath faded tarps. Everywhere she looked, work waited to be done. Sofia Ramirez approached from the far end of the nearest row. Her boots carried fresh mud and pruning shears rested at her side. "I'm glad you came," Sofia said gently. Claire embraced her without speaking. They stood together for several seconds. "He talked about you often," Sofia said. "He never stopped believing you'd come back someday." Claire looked across the quiet vineyard. "I should have visited more." Sofia smiled sadly. "He never complained about that." As evening settled over the valley, Sofia left Claire alone to spend the night in the ranch house. Inside, little had changed since her childhood. Henry's reading glasses still rested beside his favorite chair. A worn coffee mug remained on the kitchen shelf. Family photographs covered the hallway, capturing harvest festivals, birthdays, and generations smiling among green vines. Claire wandered from room to room until she reached the winery office at the end of the hallway. The heavy wooden door stood closed. She reached for the brass handle and discovered it would not turn. The office was locked. She remembered suddenly that Grandpa had always kept this room private, even as children. They had never entered without permission. Claire rested her hand against the weathered wood. Through the narrow window, she could just make out his desk, still sitting exactly where it always had, untouched by time. As the last light disappeared beyond the vineyard, she realized no one had opened that office since the day Grandpa Henry walked out of it for the final time. Claire woke before sunrise to the quiet sounds of the vineyard she had not heard in years. Wind brushed gently across the bare vines outside the ranch house, and somewhere beyond the barn, a tractor engine rumbled to life before fading again. She made coffee in her grandfather's familiar kitchen, using the old enamel kettle that still hung beside the stove. Every object seemed to hold a memory. The worn table where harvest crews once shared breakfast. The faded calendar still displaying the previous month. Henry Bennett had left the house as though he intended to return before supper. After finishing her coffee, Claire searched the hallway cabinet until she found a small ring of labeled keys. One brass key carried a faded paper tag that simply read, "Office." She walked to the locked door at the end of the hall and paused for a moment before turning the key. The lock released with a soft click. The room smelled faintly of aged wood, paper, and wine barrels. Dust floated through thin beams of morning light entering between half-closed blinds. Henry's office was modest, arranged with the same careful order she remembered from childhood. Shelves filled with binders lined one wall. Vineyard maps hung beside weather records dating back decades. His heavy oak desk faced the window overlooking the vines. Nothing appeared disturbed. Claire slowly crossed the room, running her fingertips across the polished desk. A pair of reading glasses rested beside an old ledger. His favorite fountain pen remained exactly where he had left it. She lowered herself into his chair, feeling almost like an intruder. She opened the first desk drawer and found neatly organized invoices, pruning schedules, and handwritten notes. Another drawer held seed catalogs, weather journals, and family photographs. In the bottom drawer lay a small wooden box containing old pocket watches, corkscrews, and the silver pruning knife Henry had carried for years. Everything reflected the same quiet discipline that had defined his life. As Claire examined the desk more closely, she noticed tiny scratches near the back panel that did not match the rest of the furniture. They formed a narrow outline almost invisible beneath the finish. Curious. She pressed gently against the wood. nothing moved. She reached beneath the edge of the desktop and felt a small, recessed latch hidden from view. The panel released with a soft snap. Behind it rested a concealed compartment only a few inches deep. Claire stared in surprise. Inside lay several cloth-bound journals tied together with faded leather cord, an aged vineyard map folded carefully into thirds, and a thick envelope containing black and white family photographs. She lifted the journals first. Their covers were worn smooth from years of use, each marked only with a year written neatly in Henry's handwriting. Beneath them rested the folded vineyard map. Claire spread it across the desk. At first glance, it resembled the current property she remembered, showing vineyard blocks, irrigation lines, access roads, and storage buildings. But one section immediately caught her attention. Near the western hillside, an entire block of vines appeared on the old map where no vineyard existed today. She frowned. She had walked much of the property the previous evening, and had seen nothing there except open grass and scattered oak trees. The map identified the missing section simply as Block 7. No modern survey included that designation. Before she could study it further, a knock sounded at the front door. Claire gathered the map and journals before leaving the office. Sofia Ramirez stood outside carrying 2 paper bags. "Breakfast," she said with a warm smile. "I guessed you hadn't gone grocery shopping." Claire invited her inside. They sat at the kitchen table, sharing fresh bread, fruit, and coffee. Sophia glanced toward the hallway leading to Henry's office. "You found the key?" Claire nodded. The room was exactly as he left it. She hesitated before bringing one of the journals to the table. "And I found these." Sophia's expression softened immediately. She touched the worn cover with obvious respect. "He wrote in those almost every evening after harvest season." "Did you know he hid them?" "No." Sophia smiled gently. "But I'm not surprised." Claire opened the earliest journal carefully. The pages combined vineyard observations with personal reflections. Henry recorded weather conditions, pruning methods, harvest quality, and conversations with workers. Occasionally, he added brief thoughts about family. One passage described Claire helping gather grapes as a little girl, laughing because purple juice stained her shoes. Another praised Michael for repairing broken irrigation pipes during a difficult summer. Henry never compared one grandchild with another. Each entry reflected quiet appreciation for ordinary moments. Sophia watched Claire read in silence before speaking. "Toward the end, he talked about you more often." Claire looked up. "Me? He believed you'd return someday." Sophia folded her hands around her coffee cup. "Not because you had to, because you'd finally be ready." Claire smiled sadly. "Ready for what?" Sophia shrugged. "He never explained." They spent the morning reviewing old vineyard records together. Many financial ledgers confirmed the attorney's description of mounting debt. Repair costs had increased while production steadily declined. Several vineyard blocks required replanting. Aging equipment needed replacement. Claire understood why Michael believed selling was the only realistic option. Yet Henry had continued recording careful notes almost until his final weeks, as though he never doubted the vineyard's future. After Sophia returned to supervise workers, Claire resumed reading the journals alone. Years passed across the pages through changing seasons, successful harvests, droughts, and family celebrations. Henry rarely complained. Even during difficult years, he focused on solutions rather than disappointment. Midway through one journal, Claire noticed repeated references to Block 7. Henry described checking its soil, trimming neglected vines, and recording small harvests separately from the main vineyard. Yet no explanation appeared for why the block no longer existed on current maps. Curious. Claire unfolded the old vineyard map again and compared it with a recent survey she had found in the office filing cabinet. The difference remained unmistakable. Block 7 had vanished completely from every modern document. She marked the location with a pencil before continuing through the journals. Late in the afternoon, she reached one of Henry's final entries. His handwriting had become slightly less steady, but each sentence remained carefully formed. He wrote about changing seasons, about trusting the land to those willing to care for it, and about patience during difficult years. Then one short paragraph stopped Claire completely. The best vines were never the easiest to grow. She read the sentence twice. It sounded less like advice about grapes than about people. Closing the journal gently, she reached for the next volume in the stack. As she opened the first page, a folded slip of paper fell into her lap. It contained only one handwritten sentence in Henry's familiar script. Not yet. They'll only understand after I'm gone. Claire barely slept after reading her grandfather's final note. The words remained in her thoughts long after she turned off the bedside lamp. Not yet. They'll only understand after I'm gone. She had spent years balancing numbers and solving practical problems, yet this single sentence resisted every logical explanation. Henry Bennett had never been a man who enjoyed unnecessary mystery. If he hid something, there had always been a reason. Early the next morning, she carried 2 journals, the old vineyard map, and a notebook onto the front porch. Cool air drifted across the dormant vines while sunlight slowly reached the valley. She began reading Henry's entries in chronological order, hoping she had overlooked an important detail. The journals moved naturally between vineyard work and family memories. Henry wrote about repairing broken fences with Michael after winter storms, teaching Olivia, Claire's daughter, how to recognize ripe grapes during one summer visit, and quietly celebrating when workers' children graduated from school. Claire noticed a pattern. Whenever difficult family events occurred, Henry rarely recorded arguments. Instead, he focused on acts of kindness that followed. After one disagreement between Michael and another relative, Henry simply wrote, "Pride speaks loudly. Love usually waits until everyone grows quiet." Claire closed the journal for a moment. She remembered that argument. She had been too busy with work to visit afterward, assuming time would eventually heal everything. Reading Henry's words, she wondered how many opportunities her family had allowed to disappear while waiting for someone else to make the first move. Sophia arrived carrying pruning schedules and found Claire surrounded by open journals. "You're making progress," she said with a smile. "I'm trying." Claire pointed toward the old vineyard map. "Do you remember Block 7? Sophia studied the faded drawing for several seconds before nodding slowly. "I haven't heard that name in years." "What happened to it?" "Disease damaged many of those vines before I started managing the property full-time. Some were removed, and eventually people stopped talking about that section. But Grandpa kept writing about it." Sophia looked surprised. Claire showed her several entries describing inspections, pruning, and harvest notes from Block 7 long after official vineyard records no longer mentioned it. Sophia frowned. If Henry kept visiting, he never told anyone why. They decided to walk the western hillside together. The old map led them beyond the maintained vineyard rows toward open land scattered with wild grasses and aging oak trees. Little remained to suggest grapevines had once grown there. Weathered fence posts leaned unevenly beneath climbing weeds. Fragments of rusted irrigation pipes surfaced through the soil. Claire compared the landmarks with Henry's map until she located what had once been the center of Block 7. At first glance, Nothing appeared unusual. Then Sophia knelt beside several twisted plants partly hidden beneath thick brush. She gently cleared away weeds with her gloved hands. "These aren't wild vines," she said quietly. Claire knelt beside her. Thick, weathered trunks emerged from the earth, their bark deeply textured with age. Although neglected for years, small living shoots still reached toward the winter sky. "They're still alive?" Claire asked. Sophia nodded. "Barely, but yes." She examined another nearby vine before smiling with growing amazement. "These are much older than the rest of the vineyard." Claire remembered Henry's repeated visits recorded in the journals. He had never abandoned this forgotten place. He had simply stopped speaking about it. They carefully followed the overgrown row until they counted nearly 36 surviving vines scattered beneath years of neglect. Many required extensive restoration, but their roots remained alive. Sophia stood slowly, brushing dirt from her hands. "I've worked here over 30 years, she said. "I had no idea these survived." Claire looked across the hillside. "Grandpa did." While they continued examining the vines, a pickup truck approached along the dirt road. A young man climbed out carrying a camera bag and several sample cases. Sophia waved. "That's Ethan Brooks." Ethan introduced himself with an easy smile. He owned a small neighboring winery and occasionally consulted with local growers. He had heard about Henry's passing and wanted to offer condolences. After learning about the forgotten vines, he asked if he could examine them. He walked carefully between the rows, studying trunks, leaves, and spacing with increasing interest. Finally, he stopped beside one particularly large vine. "These are remarkable," he said. "They're original plantings, aren't they?" Claire nodded toward the journals. "Grandpa seems to have cared for them privately." Ethan smiled with obvious admiration. Older vines often produce fewer grapes, but the fruit can be extraordinary. He looked across the hillside again. "Most people would have removed them years ago because they aren't profitable in the short term." Claire thought of Michael's practical advice to sell the property immediately. Looking at these weathered vines, she suddenly understood why Henry had continued returning. Some things survived because someone refused to measure their worth only by immediate results. Ethan crouched near another vine. "If these recover, they could produce something very special." Sophia agreed. "It won't be easy." Claire looked at the neglected rows stretching quietly beneath winter sunlight. Grandpa believed they were worth saving. Neither Sophia nor Ethan argued. They spent the afternoon marking damaged trellises, identifying living vines, and discussing what restoration might require. The work would demand months of careful pruning, soil improvement, and patience. Financially, replacing the old vines would make more sense. Yet every journal entry encouraged preservation rather than replacement. By late afternoon, Claire had made her decision. "We're restoring Block 7. Sophia smiled without surprise. Ethan extended his hand. "If you need advice, call me." "Thank you," Claire replied sincerely. "I probably will." Returning to the ranch house before sunset, Claire carried another journal into Henry's office. She wanted to understand why he had protected those vines for so many years. Near the end of one volume, she found detailed harvest notes describing grapes from Block 7. The pages became increasingly templates, discussing fermentation temperatures, blending ratios, and tasting observations unlike anything in the earlier journals. Then one final paragraph caught her attention. Henry had written, "This year's experimental vintage shows promise beyond expectation. It must remain unfinished until someone understands why these vines were never abandoned." Claire turned the page quickly, expecting further explanation. Instead, she found only a single handwritten sentence beneath the date of the following harvest. The final experimental vintage was never bottled. Claire returned to the line in Henry's journal 3 times before accepting what it said. The final experimental vintage was never bottled. If the wine had remained unfinished, then it had to be somewhere on the property. The main winery held no forgotten barrels. Claire had already reviewed the inventory records, and every current tank, case, and storage rack had been accounted for. The next morning, she brought the journal to Sophia. They stood inside the winery among stainless steel tanks, old wooden beams, and equipment that had been repaired too many times. "Did Grandpa ever store wine anywhere else?" Claire asked. Sophia considered the question. "There used to be a lower cellar before the winery was expanded." Henry said part of it was sealed because the foundation shifted. "Where was the entrance?" "Behind the original barrel room, I think. I never saw it open." They searched the oldest section of the building, where dust coated unused racks and the stone walls remained from Henry's first years on the property. A modern plywood partition covered one side of the room. When Claire examined it closely, she noticed the panels had been installed over older masonry. Sophia found a narrow gap near the floor. Cold air moved through it. They removed the first panel with a pry bar, revealing a stone arch filled by a heavy wooden door. Its iron latch had rusted, but the wood remained solid. Claire's pulse quickened. This wasn't sealed because of the foundation. Sophia pointed to hinges that had been carefully oiled beneath years of dust. Someone used it. The latch resisted until Ethan arrived with tools. He had come to inspect samples from Block 7, but joined the effort immediately. After several minutes, the iron released with a sharp crack. The door opened inward onto narrow stone steps descending into darkness. Claire switched on a flashlight and led the way. The air below was cool and dry, carrying the deep scent of earth, oak, and old wine. The cellar was smaller than expected, with a low ceiling supported by thick beams. Several empty racks lined the walls. In the center stood 6 barrels beneath canvas coverings. Each had been numbered in Henry's handwriting. A work table nearby held notebooks, glass tubes, a hand press, and sealed jars containing dried grape skins. Ethan removed one canvas cover carefully. "These barrels were maintained," he said. "The seals are old, but they're intact." Claire opened the journal to the technical entries. The numbers matched those on the barrels. Henry had recorded fermentation temperatures, sugar levels, acidity, and small adjustments over several seasons. His methods blended traditional practices with careful experimentation. Sophia read over Claire's shoulder. "He never showed me these records." There was no accusation in her voice, only hurt surprise. She had worked beside Henry for over 30 years. Claire understood what the hidden cellar meant to her. "Maybe he wasn't hiding them from you," Claire said. "Maybe he was waiting." Ethan examined the notes. He was testing different blends from Block 7, small quantities, long aging, almost no intervention. Would the wine still be drinkable? Claire asked. Possibly, but opening anything carelessly could ruin what remains. They cataloged each barrel without disturbing the seals. 4 contained experimental blends. 1 appeared empty. The 6th stood apart beneath a darker cloth. Unlike the others, it had no number. A small metal tag hung from its rim, tied with faded red string. Claire lifted the tag and read the handwritten words aloud. "Open only when the family believes again." Silence settled over the cellar. Sophia looked away first. "That sounds like Henry." Claire touched the barrel gently. The instruction was not addressed to a winemaker. It was addressed to the family that no longer gathered at the vineyard, the family now discussing debt, foreclosure, and sale. She wondered whether Henry had known exactly how divided they would become after his death. Ethan continued studying the journal. These blending notes could be valuable. He spent decades refining this. He pointed to repeated comparisons between Block 7 fruit and grapes from the main vineyard. Henry had adjusted proportions in tiny increments, returning year after year to the same idea. He wasn't making one unusual barrel, Ethan said. He was building a method. Claire felt both admiration and frustration. Her grandfather had left behind extraordinary work, but no explanation for how it could save a vineyard drowning in debt. That afternoon, Michael arrived after Claire called him about the cellar. He descended the stone steps reluctantly, still wearing business clothes from his office. For a few minutes, even he seemed impressed. Then Claire explained her plan to restore Block 7 and preserve the experimental barrels until they could be evaluated properly. Michael's expression hardened. "How much will that cost?" "We don't know yet." "Then you don't have a plan." "We have something Grandpa spent years protecting." Michael looked around the cellar. Old barrels don't erase bank loans. Claire handed him the journal. He flipped through several pages but barely studied them. The vineyard is losing money. Equipment needs replacement. Workers need wages. Restoring vines that barely produce fruit is not responsible. Sophia remained silent near the stairs, but Claire saw tension in her face. Selling everything without understanding what he left behind isn't responsible either, Claire said. You're letting grief make financial decisions. The words struck more deeply than Michael intended. Claire closed the journal. I spent 28 years making safe decisions for everyone else. I'm allowed to take time before I surrender the one thing Grandpa trusted me to protect. Michael exhaled and lowered his voice. I'm trying to protect you. This place can take whatever you have left. Then help me understand it instead of telling me to abandon it. He looked toward the sealed barrel. And what exactly are you expecting to find in there? A miracle? No. I'm expecting to find out why Grandpa believed it mattered. Michael shook his head. Belief doesn't pay debt. He climbed the steps and left, without saying goodbye. The argument followed Claire through the rest of the day. She reviewed the cellar records with Ethan, but Michael's warning remained painfully reasonable. The bank would not care about old vines, family memories, or a barrel carrying a mysterious message. Numbers had governed Claire's professional life, and every number connected to Bennett Vineyard pointed toward failure. Before leaving, Ethan stood beside the unmarked barrel. Your brother is right about the risk, he said, but Henry's notes are exceptional. This wasn't sentimental work. You think the wine could be important? I think he knew exactly what he was doing. That evening, Claire returned to the cellar alone. She placed Henry's journal on the work table and read the final blending entries beneath the beam of her flashlight. The last page contained no formula, only a reflection written in his unsteady hand. Wine cannot be hurried into becoming what it was meant to be. Neither can people. Both require time, pressure, and faith after disappointment. Claire looked at the barrel carrying his final instruction. The family did not believe again. Michael believed the vineyard was finished. Olivia feared Claire was destroying her future. Even Claire could not yet say with confidence that the land could survive. She reached toward the sealed lid but stopped before touching it. Grandpa had preserved this barrel through declining harvests, mounting debt, and the final years of his life. Whatever waited inside had been intended for a specific moment. Claire lifted the metal tag once more and read the words in the silent cellar. Open only when the family believes again. The bank representatives arrived at Bennett Vineyard just after 9 on Monday morning. Claire watched their dark sedan stop beside the winery while Sophia directed 2 workers toward a damaged irrigation line. One group was trying to keep the land alive. The other had come to decide how soon it might be taken away. Claire met them in Henry's office with every ledger, loan statement, tax record, and production report arranged across the desk. Years of accounting experience helped her understand the problem, but understanding did not make it smaller. Equipment payments were overdue. 2 operating loans had reached their limits. Unless Claire produced a credible repayment plan within 6 weeks, the bank would begin foreclosure proceedings. Selling voluntarily would preserve more value, one representative said. Claire kept her voice steady. I'm not ready to discuss a sale. Then we need evidence the business can recover. After they left, she remained behind the desk, staring at Henry's fountain pen beside figures that seemed determined to erase everything he had built. Sophia entered quietly. How bad? Worse than Michael said. Payroll was due Friday, and the operating account could cover only part of it. Sophia immediately offered to delay her own wages. Claire shook her head. You've already given this place 30 years. That is exactly why I can wait. Ethan arrived before noon and joined them in the barrel room. Together they reviewed expenses line by line. Sophia proposed reducing work on 2 less productive sections while protecting Block 7. Ethan offered to use his laboratory equipment without charge. Claire canceled non-essential orders, negotiated extensions with suppliers, and arranged to sell unused machines. The cuts bought time, but not enough. By Thursday, she still lacked the money for full payroll. She gathered the workers inside the winery and explained the situation honestly. I can pay 70% now, the rest within 3 weeks. Or I'll give each of you written claims against the estate. One worker asked whether she planned to sell. I'm trying not to. Sophia stepped beside her. Henry trusted Claire. I do too. The workers accepted the delay, though Claire saw worry in their faces. Their loyalty made failure feel more personal. Olivia arrived that afternoon from Sacramento. She hugged Claire tightly, then studied the aging winery with concern. At 30, she recognized the signs her mother tried to conceal. You haven't slept. I'm managing. That's what you said during the divorce. Claire explained the loans, neglected vines, and foreclosure deadline. Olivia listened, then looked toward the window. Mom, Grandpa loved this place, but he wouldn't want it to destroy you. I know. Do you? The question carried fear rather than criticism. Claire took her hand. For most of my life, I chose the safest thing available. I supported everyone else's plans. I stayed in a marriage long after I stopped recognizing myself. I'm not risking this because I want another burden. I need to know whether Grandpa left us something worth continuing. Olivia's expression softened. And if he didn't, then I'll face that honestly. That evening, Claire brought Olivia to the hidden cellar. Sophia and Ethan waited beside the unmarked barrel. Claire had spent days thinking about Henry's instruction. Open only when the family believes again. Michael still believed selling was the only rational choice. Yet Sophia believed in Henry's work. Ethan believed the wine mattered. The workers had trusted Claire with unpaid wages. Olivia, despite her fear, had come instead of staying away. Claire realized belief did not mean certainty. It meant choosing to remain when certainty was impossible. "I think this is the moment Grandpa meant," she said. Olivia read the metal tag. "Are you sure?" "No, but I believe enough to open it." Ethan sterilized the tools and removed the seal carefully. A faint scent entered the cold cellar. He drew a sample, checked it beneath the light, then poured measured amounts into 4 glasses. The wine was deep garnet. Ethan smelled it first, and his expression changed. Sophia noticed. "What tasted?" Claire lifted the glass. The wine opened slowly, carrying dark fruit, earth, cedar, and something bright beneath the age. It felt structured but alive, powerful without bitterness. She was not trained to describe it precisely, yet she understood why Henry had protected it. This was not a sentimental experiment. It was the result of decades of attention. Sophia closed her eyes after tasting. "That is Block 7. "How can you tell?" Olivia asked. "The fruit always had that mineral finish." Ethan took another careful sip. "The balance is extraordinary. Henry built the blend around those old vines, then let time finish the work." Beneath the barrel tag, Claire noticed a narrow envelope fixed to the wood with wax. Her name was written across the front. Inside was a single page from Henry. He wrote that tradition should never become fear of change, and change should never become an excuse to discard what still carried life. He had preserved the barrel not as something to copy exactly, but as proof that the neglected vines could produce something rare. His final lines were addressed directly to Claire. "Trust what I taught you, but do not imitate me. Use your own judgment. The next vintage must belong to you." Claire pressed the page against her chest. For the first time since inheriting the vineyard, the debt did not feel like the only truth in the room. The barrel offered no immediate money, but it gave them direction. Ethan spread Henry's blending notes across the work table. "If we restore enough fruit this season and combine his method with modern control, we could make a small release, not a copy. Your first vintage." Claire looked at Sophia, then Olivia. "Would it be good enough to matter?" Ethan glanced toward the open barrel. "There's one way to find out." He explained that entries for a prestigious international wine competition would close soon after harvest. A strong result could attract buyers, distributors, and enough attention to change the vineyard's position with the bank. Claire almost laughed. They had delayed payroll, failing equipment, and vines barely returning to life. "You want us to compete against established wineries? I want you to submit what Henry spent decades preparing you to make." Ethan placed the entry information beside the letter. "Claire, this may be the vineyard's last real chance." Claire did not answer Ethan immediately. The competition entry form lay beside Henry's letter, its deadline printed in bold across the top. Entering would require fees, laboratory certification, bottles, labels, and a finished wine worthy of comparison with producers whose vineyards had far more money and equipment. Bennett Vineyard could barely cover wages. Still, when Claire looked toward the open barrel, she understood that waiting for safer circumstances would mean waiting until the vineyard no longer existed. "We'll enter," she said. Sophia nodded once, as if she had expected nothing else. Olivia smiled despite her concern. Ethan folded the form and placed it inside Henry's journal. "Then we need a harvest." Block 7 became the center of their work. The old vines produced less fruit than the younger sections, but each surviving cluster received careful attention. Sophia taught Claire how to identify damaged shoots, balance canopy growth, and judge whether the vines were carrying more fruit than their weakened roots could support. Claire spent long mornings tying branches, clearing weeds by hand, and recording soil moisture exactly as Henry had done. Her body ached in places her office life had never tested, yet the physical exhaustion felt honest. Every completed row showed visible progress. Henry's journals guided them through decisions, but never offered simple instructions. One entry recommended waiting through a warm spell before irrigating, while another warned that late-season water could weaken flavor. Claire learned to read the weather, the leaves, and Sophia's expression before making choices. Ethan installed inexpensive monitoring tools and helped repair old fermentation equipment rather than replace it. Tradition and modern control began working together. Just as Henry's letter had advised, the first serious obstacle arrived with an unseasonably hot week. Afternoon temperatures climbed high enough to threaten the recovering fruit. Several irrigation valves failed on the western hillside, and replacement parts would take days to arrive. Claire found Sophia and two workers digging beside the main line before sunrise. "We can reroute water from Block 4, Sophia said, "but pressure will drop across both sections." Claire studied the maps and Henry's notes. Years earlier, he had described using temporary gravity tanks during a similar failure. An abandoned holding tank still stood above the old barn. By noon, Ethan had helped clean it. Olivia located usable hoses from a supplier, and Michael unexpectedly arrived with fittings from a hardware warehouse near his office. Claire stared when he unloaded the boxes. "Sophia called," he said. "She said you were about to lose the crop. I thought you wanted me to sell." "I do." He avoided her eyes. "That doesn't mean I want Grandpa's vines to die while you decide." They worked until dark, connecting the temporary line across the slope. Michael argued with Claire over pressure calculations, then silently corrected a leaking joint when her solution failed. It was the first time they had worked side by side at the vineyard since they were teenagers. Nothing between them was repaired. But when water finally reached Block 7, Michael looked across the rows with unmistakable relief. "Grandpa used to make us carry buckets up here," he said. Claire remembered. "You always spilled yours before reaching the top." "Because you kicked the back of my boots." For a brief moment, they laughed. Then the old tension returned, though less sharply than before. Michael left the next morning but came back 2 days later to help repair harvest bins. He continued warning Claire about the dead. Yet he stopped calling the vineyard hopeless. As the grapes ripened, family members began appearing on weekends. Olivia organized meals for workers and handled online orders from the small inventory still available. Michael reviewed equipment leases and negotiated a lower payment on one overdue account. Even cousins who had supported selling came for a day of picking after hearing that the final vintage might depend on every usable cluster. Claire understood that some came from guilt and others from curiosity, but she accepted every pair of hands. Harvest began before dawn beneath cool September air. Sophia moved through Block 7 tasting grapes and checking sugar levels. Ethan prepared the crush equipment while Claire stood at the first row with Henry's pruning knife in her pocket. She cut the opening cluster and placed it gently into a shallow bin. No one applauded. The moment felt too serious for ceremony. They worked carefully to avoid crushing the fruit, collecting less than the main vineyard produced from a single healthy section. The small yield frightened Claire, but Ethan reminded her that concentration mattered more than volume. By afternoon, the first grapes entered fermentation. Claire followed Henry's records while making adjustments based on the fruit in front of her. She reduced one portion of the blend, increased another, and chose a cooler fermentation than Henry had used in his final experiment. Each decision felt like stepping beyond the protection of his instructions. When she hesitated, Sophia said, "He told you not to imitate him." Claire nodded and approved the change. Difficult weather returned during the final harvest days. A storm threatened before the remaining fruit had fully ripened. Waiting could improve flavor, but one heavy rain might split the grapes and ruin everything. Henry's journals contained entries from similar seasons, though his decisions varied according to conditions. Claire walked the rows with Sophia and Ethan, tasting berries beneath darkening clouds. "We pick tonight," Claire decided. The crew worked under portable lights until after midnight. Michael arrived without being asked and brought additional workers from a nearby packing company. Olivia carried food and coffee between the rows. When rain finally began near dawn, the last bin had already reached the winery. The vintage was small, but it was safe. Fermentation demanded weeks of attention. Claire slept in short intervals, checking temperatures through the night and recording every change. One tank began warming too quickly after a cooling pump failed. Ethan helped rig a temporary system while Sophia manually circulated the wine. Another batch developed a harsh edge that threatened the blend. Claire used Henry's notes as reference, but chose a slower correction that preserved the fruit's character. With each problem, she became less dependent on asking what Grandpa would have done and more willing to decide what the wine needed now. When the final blend was ready, Ethan poured samples into 4 glasses inside the hidden cellar. Claire tasted first. The wine was younger and brighter than Henry's, with the same mineral depth from Block 7, but a different balance. It did not copy the preserved barrel. It carried traces of Henry's work while unmistakably belonging to the present harvest. Sophia smiled. "This one sounds like you." They bottled the competition entry by hand. Olivia designed a simple label bearing the Bennett name and a small drawing of the western hillside. Michael arrived as Claire sealed the final bottle. He examined it quietly. "Do you really think it can win?" "I think it deserves to be judged." He nodded. "That's not the same thing." "No," Claire said, "but it's enough." Ethan packed the required bottles in protective cases and drove them to the shipping center before the deadline. Claire watched his truck disappear down the road, feeling as though the vineyard's entire future had left inside one cardboard box. The following morning, she returned to Henry's office and found a certified envelope from the bank beneath the door. The letter confirmed that Bennett Vineyard's final foreclosure review had been scheduled. The date came 3 weeks before the competition results would be announced. Claire read the bank's notice twice before placing it beside Henry's journals. The foreclosure review was scheduled in 3 weeks, well before the international wine competition would announce its winners. Even if their entry impressed the judges, the recognition would come too late to help. She stood alone in Henry's office, staring through the window at the vineyard. The vines no longer looked abandoned. Workers moved steadily between the rows, repairing posts, clearing weeds, and preparing the land for winter. Yet the healthier the vineyard became, the more painful it felt to imagine losing it. That afternoon, she met with the bank manager and presented updated financial records. The harvest had generated modest income. Several overdue bills had been reduced, and unnecessary equipment had been sold. Claire explained the restoration of Block 7, the hidden cellar, and the competition entry. Though she understood none of those accomplishments guaranteed repayment, the manager listened respectfully before folding his hands. "Mrs. Bennett, you've accomplished more than most owners would have in a few months. But our decision has to be based on current financial performance, not future possibilities." Claire nodded. She had expected the answer. "Is there anything else I can provide?" Evidence of sustained revenue would help. Unfortunately, hope isn't something we can enter into a loan report. She thanked him anyway and drove back to the vineyard with the uncomfortable feeling that she had done everything possible and still fallen short. Rather than surrender to discouragement, Claire buried herself in work. She reviewed invoices each morning, repaired fencing with Sophia during the afternoons, and spent evenings studying Henry's journals for small efficiencies that might reduce costs. One notebook described how Henry reused rainwater collection systems during drought years. Another explained simple maintenance methods that extended the life of aging barrels. None offered dramatic solutions, but together, they saved money the vineyard desperately needed. Sophia noticed Claire arriving before sunrise and leaving long after dark. "You'll wear yourself out before the bank makes its decision," she warned. Claire smiled faintly. "If the vineyard survives, I'll rest afterward. And if it doesn't?" Claire looked toward Block 7. "Then at least Grandpa won't recognize this place as abandoned." The workers remained loyal despite the uncertainty. One mechanic volunteered his weekends, repairing equipment that otherwise would have required expensive replacement. Another employee postponed retirement until the season ended. Their commitment reminded Claire that Bennett Vineyard represented far more than her inheritance. It supported families whose lives had been connected to the land for decades. Olivia searched for ways to create immediate income. She suggested inviting local residents to a weekend tasting featuring the vineyard's remaining inventory and tours of the restored Block 7. Claire hesitated. "People know we're struggling. Then let them see what you're fighting for." Sophia supported the idea. Ethan agreed to help explain the winemaking process, and several workers volunteered to prepare the property. The tasting required almost no advertising. Word spread naturally through neighboring farms, churches, and local businesses that had respected Henry for years. On Saturday morning, Claire expected perhaps 20 visitors. By noon, the parking area was nearly full. Families wandered among the vines, while Sophia explained the history of the vineyard. Ethan demonstrated how the old vines differed from younger plantings. Claire led small groups through the winery, carefully avoiding the hidden cellar, while sharing stories from Henry's journals about patience, craftsmanship, and caring for the land. She noticed people listening less to the technical details than to the history behind them. Many remembered Henry personally. Others brought children who had never visited a working vineyard before. At the tasting table, visitors purchased bottles from the vineyard's remaining stock faster than Claire expected. Local restaurants placed small orders after hearing Ethan describe the upcoming vintage. A nearby grocery owner offered to feature Bennett wines in a regional products display. None of the sales erased the debt, but together they produced more revenue in one weekend than Claire had imagined possible. Late that afternoon, Michael walked through the crowd carrying folding chairs toward the picnic area. Claire watched him for a moment before joining him. "I didn't know you were coming," Olivia called. He unfolded another chair. "She said you needed help." Claire smiled. "You could have said no." Michael looked across the vineyard where children laughed while older visitors shared memories of Henry. "I almost did." He paused before continuing. "Then I remembered Grandpa telling me once that a vineyard isn't measured by acreage. It's measured by the people who keep coming back." Claire sat beside him beneath the shade of an old oak tree. "You still think selling makes sense?" Michael remained quiet for several moments. "Financially, maybe." He looked toward Block 7, where Sophia was showing visitors the restored vines. "But Grandpa wasn't trying to leave us money. He was trying to leave us something worth protecting." Claire turned toward him in surprise. "You believe that now?" He nodded slowly. "I think he trusted you because he knew you'd see something I couldn't." The words meant more to Claire than she expected. Michael had spent weeks warning her against hope. Hearing him admit that Henry's faith might have been justified felt like another small part of the family beginning to heal. As the last visitors departed, Olivia counted the day's receipts. "We're not rich," she said with a laugh, "but we sold nearly everything we brought." Sophia added the restaurant orders to Claire's notebook. "People want to come back." Ethan looked across the vineyard with satisfaction. "They came for Henry's story. They'll return for your wine." Claire stood quietly for a moment, watching workers gather tables while evening settled over the hills. She realized the tasting had accomplished something no financial report could measure. The community no longer viewed Bennett Vineyard as a failing business waiting to disappear. It had become a place people wanted to see survive. During the following week, several volunteers returned to help repair fences, repaint weathered signs, and clear brush from unused paths. A retired carpenter restored benches near the tasting area. A local printer donated updated brochures featuring the vineyard's history. Even without knowing the competition results, people had begun investing their time because they believed the vineyard still had a future. Claire added every donation and sale to the financial records she planned to present during the foreclosure review. The numbers remained difficult, but they no longer pointed only downward. Late Friday afternoon, while organizing invoices in Henry's office, she heard a vehicle stop outside. Ethan stepped onto the porch carrying a large white envelope marked with the competition's official seal. Claire's heart began to race before he even spoke. He handed her the envelope with a broad smile. "It isn't the results," he said. "Those come later." Claire opened it carefully. Inside was a formal invitation requesting her attendance at the International Wine Awards ceremony. Their entry had advanced to the final judging, and representatives from every finalist vineyard were expected to be present. She looked up from the letter in stunned silence as Ethan said softly, "Claire, Bennett Vineyard is officially a finalist." Claire held the invitation for a long time after Ethan left Henry's office. Bennett Vineyard was officially among the finalists at one of the country's most respected international wine competitions. The words hardly seemed real. Only a few months earlier, she had walked into the vineyard believing it would soon disappear beneath unpaid debt. Now the wine made from forgotten vines stood beside entries from wineries she had admired only through magazine articles. Sophia read the invitation twice before smiling. Henry would have been proud. Claire folded the letter carefully. He would probably tell us not to celebrate too early. Ethan laughed. That sounds exactly like him. Preparations for the trip were simple because there was little money for anything elaborate. Claire chose a navy dress she had worn years earlier to an accounting awards banquet. Olivia adjusted the hem, pressed every wrinkle from the fabric, and borrowed a simple silver necklace from a friend. "You don't need anything expensive," Olivia said, while helping her mother pin back her hair. "You're carrying Grandpa's work with you." Claire smiled at her reflection. "No, I'm carrying all of ours." Michael drove them to the awards ceremony, held at a historic conference center surrounded by vineyards much larger than Bennett. Luxury vehicles filled the parking area. Winery owners greeted one another like old colleagues, discussing harvest yields, export markets, and aging programs with easy confidence. Claire suddenly became aware of how unfamiliar she felt in the room. Her vineyard still struggled to meet payroll. Her winery depended on repaired equipment and volunteer labor. She almost turned back toward the entrance. Ethan noticed immediately. "Remember what Henry wrote?" Claire nodded. "Trust what he taught me, but use my own judgment." Exactly. They entered together. The reception hall displayed bottles from every finalist. Claire found Bennett Vineyard near the end of the table. The label Olivia had designed looked modest beside polished international brands, yet it stood there just the same. Visitors stopped to read the description of Block 7 and the vineyard's long history. Some asked thoughtful questions about the old vines and the unusual blend. Claire answered honestly, never exaggerating their story. She explained that the vineyard had nearly been lost, that the wine reflected both traditional methods and careful adaptation, and that she had inherited far more knowledge than experience. Several judges listened quietly before moving to the next display. Their expressions revealed nothing. Throughout the afternoon, Claire met winemakers whose families had worked vineyards for generations. Instead of arrogance, she found generosity. One elderly producer congratulated her simply for reaching the finals. Another said preserving old vines required courage because they demanded patience without guaranteeing reward. Claire realized Henry would have enjoyed speaking with them. During a break, she stepped onto the terrace overlooking rows of vineyards stretching toward distant hills. The landscape reminded her of mornings at Bennett Vineyard when she had walked among Block 7 before sunrise. She closed her eyes for a moment and remembered Henry's voice. Never rush living things. Good roots take time. Olivia joined her outside. Nervous? Claire laughed softly. More peaceful than nervous. Really? I came here believing I needed to prove something. She looked across the valley. Now I think Grandpa already proved it. We just finished his work. Back inside, the finalists gathered in the main ballroom. Tables surrounded a broad stage where polished wooden barrels and harvest photographs decorated the backdrop. Judges spoke briefly about craftsmanship, stewardship of the land, and the importance of preserving regional traditions while embracing thoughtful innovation. Claire appreciated hearing words Henry himself might have spoken. Awards for several categories were announced first. Applause echoed through the hall as respected wineries accepted medals for sparkling wines, white wines, and sustainable farming. Bennett Vineyard remained unmentioned. Claire felt surprisingly calm. Becoming a finalist already seemed impossible enough. Ethan leaned toward her. No matter what happens next, people will remember this vineyard now. Claire nodded. That's already more than I expected. At another table, Michael watched his sister with quiet pride. Weeks earlier, he had insisted selling the vineyard immediately was the only sensible choice. Seeing Bennett Vineyard represented among the finalists forced him to admit how completely he had underestimated both Henry's vision and Claire's determination. When the judges introduced the final category, the room grew noticeably quieter. It recognized the competition's highest honor, awarded to the wine demonstrating exceptional quality, craftsmanship, and character. Claire folded her hands beneath the table to steady them. She no longer thought about trophies. She thought about Sophia kneeling beside forgotten vines, Ethan opening the hidden barrel, Olivia welcoming visitors during the community tasting, Michael repairing irrigation lines through the night, and Henry patiently recording decades of observations in journals hidden inside a locked office. Every difficult step had led here. The lead judge spoke about the winning wine without revealing its name. The judges praised its authenticity rather than perfection, noting that it honored tradition while expressing a clear individual voice. They described remarkable balance, distinctive character, and evidence that careful stewardship could revive vineyards many would have abandoned. Claire lowered her eyes. The description sounded painfully familiar. Yet she refused to let herself believe it referred to Bennett Vineyard. Ethan glanced toward her but remained silent. Olivia reached across the table and squeezed Claire's hand. Michael watched the stage without blinking. Around the ballroom, finalists sat perfectly still. The presenter lifted a sealed envelope from the podium. Cameras turned toward the audience. The room became silent enough that Claire could hear her own breathing. The presenter smiled before breaking the seal. The recipient of this year's highest honor. He unfolded the card slowly, looked up toward the finalists, and prepared to announce the winning vineyard. Bennett Vineyard, the presenter announced, for its Block 7 vintage. For one suspended second, Claire did not move. The applause rose around her, but the name sounded distant, almost impossible. Olivia gripped her hand and laughed through sudden tears. Ethan struck the table once with both palms before standing. Michael covered his mouth, staring at Claire as though he had just understood something he should have seen years ago. "Mom," Olivia said, pulling her upright, "that's you." Claire walked toward the stage on unsteady legs, faces blurred beneath the ballroom lights. All she could see clearly was the small Bennett label displayed beside the podium and the drawing of the western hillside where Henry's forgotten vines had survived beneath years of weeds. The presenter handed her a crystal award engraved with the vineyard's name. Then he announced that the honor included a substantial cash prize, a national distribution consultation, and guaranteed placement at several major wine exhibitions. The room applauded again, but Claire's breath caught at the amount of the prize. It would not erase every debt, yet combined with the opportunities attached to the award, it could stop the immediate collapse of the vineyard. "Would you like to say a few words?" the presenter asked. Claire looked toward her family. Sophia had not been able to attend, but Claire imagined her standing in the winery with soil on her boots and Henry's certainty in her eyes. Ethan nodded encouragement. Olivia was openly crying. Michael stood with both hands resting on the table, his expression filled with pride and regret. Claire stepped toward the microphone. "This wine came from vines most people believed were no longer worth saving," she began. Her voice trembled, then steadied. "My grandfather, Henry Bennett, planted them and protected them long after their value was questioned. He left behind journals, methods, and one final experimental barrel. But the most important thing he left was a belief that neglect does not mean something is finished." The room grew still. "I inherited Bennett Vineyard at 52, after a divorce and at a time when I thought the safest part of my life was already behind me. The vineyard was deeply in debt. The old vines were hidden. I had more fear than experience. This award belongs to the people who stayed. Sophia Ramirez, who cared for the land for more than 30 years. Ethan Brooks, who recognized what those vines could become. Our workers, who accepted uncertainty and kept showing up. My daughter, Olivia, who reminded me that a story can bring people home. And my brother, Michael, who learned to believe beside me." Michael lowered his hand. Claire tightened her hands around the crystal award. "My grandfather wrote that wine and people both require time, pressure, and faith after disappointment. I understand that now. Thank you for recognizing not only our wine, but the value of giving something living another chance." The applause that followed felt different from the first. It was no longer directed only at a winning bottle. It carried recognition of the road behind it. When Claire returned to the table, Michael embraced her before she could sit. He held on longer than expected. "I was wrong," he said quietly, "about the vineyard, about you." Claire pulled back enough to see his face. "I thought Grandpa left it to you because you were the sentimental one." "I thought he expected me to handle reality." He glanced toward the award. "He left it to you because you could see reality without letting it decide everything." Claire felt years of unspoken distance between them loosen. "You helped save the harvest. After nearly convincing you to abandon it, you came back." Michael nodded, his eyes wet. "I should have sooner." Reporters and buyers surrounded their table before Claire could answer. Questions came rapidly. How old were the vines? How many bottles could Bennett Vineyard produce? Would the winning wine be released nationally? Ethan protected Claire from promising more than the vineyard could deliver. He explained that Block 7's yield was limited and that preserving quality mattered more than rushing production. Claire repeated the same principle when distributors pressed for numbers. "We will grow carefully," she said. The vineyard nearly failed because too much was demanded from too little. We won't repeat that mistake. By the end of the evening, she had collected more business cards than Bennett Vineyard had received in the previous decade. Restaurant groups requested allocations. A respected distributor offered to visit the property. A journalist wanted to write about Henry's journals and the restoration of Block 7. The attention was overwhelming. But for once, Claire did not feel invisible inside someone else's success. The decisions were hers to make. On the drive home, the Crystal Award rested inside its case on Olivia's lap. Michael drove while Ethan answered messages from winemakers who had already heard the result. Claire watched dark vineyards pass beyond the window. "Sophia doesn't know yet," Olivia said. "She told me not to call unless we won." Ethan replied, "She said she wanted to hear Claire's voice." It was nearly midnight when they reached Bennett Vineyard. Lights glowed outside the winery. Sophia stood on the porch with the workers, neighbors, volunteers, and several family members who had gathered despite the late hour. Someone had hung a hand-painted sign across the doorway, "Welcome home, Claire." When she stepped from the car carrying the award, the crowd erupted. Sophia did not cheer. She simply walked forward and placed both hands around Claire's face. "He knew," she whispered. Claire's eyes filled. "I wish he were here." "He is in every row you saved." Inside the winery, they opened bottles from the remaining inventory. No one suggested opening Henry's preserved barrel again. Its purpose had already been fulfilled. Claire carried the award down to the hidden cellar and placed it on the work table beside his final letter. The crystal caught the dim light, casting a bright reflection across the words. "The next vintage must belong to you." Michael entered behind her. "The prize money will help," he said. "The bank still has to approve the repayment plan." Claire nodded. The foreclosure review had not vanished simply because a room of judges applauded. "Tomorrow I'll update the figures." "We'll update them," Michael corrected, for the first time. Claire heard no doubt in his voice. Her phone rang before she could respond. The bank manager's name appeared on the screen. Claire answered, and his tone was formal. "Mrs. Bennett, congratulations. We've seen the announcement. The review committee met tonight, and we've reached a decision regarding Bennett Vineyard." Claire held the phone tightly as the celebration around her faded into silence. Everyone in the cellar watched her face, waiting for the bank manager to continue. "Mrs. Bennett," he said, "after reviewing tonight's developments, the committee has voted to suspend foreclosure proceedings immediately." Claire closed her eyes. She had prepared herself for another negotiation, another request for documents, another reminder that numbers mattered more than hope. Instead, the words settled over her like the first quiet morning after a storm. "The award changes your financial outlook significantly," the manager continued. "Combined with the distribution opportunities, updated repayment projections, and the improvements you've already documented, we believe the vineyard now has a realistic path forward. We would like to restructure the existing loans rather than proceed with foreclosure." Claire let out a slow breath she had been holding for months. "Thank you," she said simply. "You earned this opportunity," he replied. "Congratulations, Mrs. Bennett." The call ended. For a moment, Claire remained perfectly still. Then she looked around the cellar at the people who had stayed beside her through every uncertain day. The foreclosure is suspended, she whispered. No one moved at first. Then Olivia threw her arms around her mother. Ethan laughed aloud. Michael leaned against the stone wall, covering his eyes with one hand. Sophia smiled through tears she made no effort to hide. The workers waiting near the cellar entrance began applauding, and the sound echoed through the old stone room Henry had hidden for so many years. Claire looked toward the preserved barrel that had started everything. "We did it," she said softly. Sophia shook her head with gentle affection. "No," she answered. "You did what Henry believed you would do." The following weeks passed with a different kind of work. Instead of fighting to survive each day, Claire focused on building a future carefully. She met repeatedly with the bank, presenting revised financial plans based on the competition prize, confirmed distribution agreements, and the growing interest from restaurants and specialty retailers. Years of accounting experience, once spent helping other businesses succeed, finally served something that belonged to her. The repayment schedule remained demanding, but it was realistic. Bennett Vineyard would continue operating. Ethan helped organize production plans that respected the limits of Block 7. Winning once doesn't give us permission to rush, he reminded everyone. Claire agreed. The old vines had survived because Henry never demanded more from them than they could honestly give. They would expand slowly, protecting quality instead of chasing quick profits. Sophia trained younger workers using the methods Henry had practiced for decades, while encouraging them to adapt when conditions changed. She often repeated the line from Henry's letter that had become Claire's guide. "Trust what I taught you, but do not imitate me." The words gradually spread through the vineyard until they became part of everyday conversation. Michael remained involved even after the immediate crisis ended. He visited weekly to review budgets, negotiate supplier contracts, and help modernize office systems. One afternoon, while filing old estate documents, he found himself standing beside Claire in Henry's office. "I almost convinced you to sell this place," he said quietly. Claire smiled. "You were trying to protect me." "I was trying to protect you from disappointment." He looked toward the window overlooking Block 7. "Turns out disappointment wasn't the thing you needed protection from." Claire closed one of Henry's journals. "Neither was failure." Michael laughed softly. "Grandpa would have enjoyed proving me wrong." "He did," Claire answered. "He just needed a little more time." Their relationship no longer depended on agreement. It rested on mutual respect. Something they had nearly forgotten was possible. Olivia visited often, balancing her own career with weekends at the vineyard. She expanded the vineyard's online presence by sharing photographs of harvest mornings, restored vines, and Henry's handwritten journals. Visitors began arriving from across the state after reading the story behind Block 7. Some came because of the award. Many stayed because they felt connected to the family's journey. Claire insisted every tour include Henry's philosophy, rather than only the winning wine. "People remember stories longer than trophies," she often said. The tasting room became a place where guests lingered. Sophia welcomed returning visitors by name. Ethan hosted educational tastings explaining how neglected vines could still produce extraordinary fruit when treated with patience. Michael occasionally surprised everyone by leading financial discussions with young vineyard owners curious about balancing tradition with practical reality. The vineyard no longer belonged only to the Bennett family. It had become part of the surrounding community once again. Late one autumn afternoon, nearly a year after Claire had first walked through the locked office door, she climbed the western hillside, alone. Block 7 stretched before her, healthy and orderly without losing the quiet character that had drawn Henry back year after year. The old vines still twisted toward the sky with uneven trunks shaped by time and hardship. They had not become young again. They had simply been given the chance to continue. Claire sat on the familiar bench overlooking the rows. She carried Henry's final journal and the letter he had attached to the preserved barrel. The pages had become worn from being read so often. She no longer searched them for instructions. Instead, she read them the way people revisit conversations with someone they miss. As the afternoon light settled across the vineyard, she noticed one final folded page tucked inside the back cover. Hidden beneath the binding. It was not a new mystery. It had simply escaped her attention before. Henry's handwriting was unsteady but unmistakable. "Claire," it began, "if you are reading this, then you stayed longer than fear expected you to. That is enough for me." She smiled before continuing. "I never wanted you to inherit perfect land. Perfect things teach very little. I wanted you to inherit something that required your own courage. The vineyard did not need another version of me. It needed the person you would become while saving it. If others someday praise the wine, thank them kindly. But remember that the greatest harvest is never measured in bottles. It is measured by the people who leave stronger than they arrived." Claire lowered the page and looked across the vineyard. Workers laughed near the winery as they finished the day's tasks. Olivia was helping visitors load wine into their cars. Ethan and Sophia were walking through Block 7 discussing pruning plans for winter. Michael stood outside Henry's office speaking with a supplier before waving toward the hillside when he noticed Claire watching. She waved back. For years, she had believed that divorce at 52 marked the closing chapter of her life, proof that the future would only grow smaller. Instead, it had become the unexpected beginning of a life she had never imagined. She had not merely saved a vineyard. She had reclaimed her own voice, rebuilt her family one conversation at a time, honored the grandfather who believed in her before she believed in herself, and discovered that starting over was not reserved for the young. As the sun slipped behind the western hills, its final light settled across Block 7, turning the old vines gold. Claire folded Henry's letter carefully and placed it back inside the journal. Then she rose, walked down the hillside toward the people waiting below, and returned home.